Trauma is a word we hear about all the time throughout society. Sometimes it's misused as well. Often when we think of abuse and trauma, we think of somebody getting beaten up, somebody getting raped, or a person going through a hurricane or going off to war. Many times we minimize what happens to us because it's not that significant. It's not as big as those things I just mentioned. And now I'm not saying this so we can have a pity party or be victims, but you've got to understand what happened to you and why it happened to you in order to get better from it. My abuse and trauma created so much desperation for me that I was like a starving person. I was desperate for attention, love, and I would take anything, even if it wasn't good enough for me, if I got just a little bit of that. It's like if you're starving and you are needing something to eat, you'll eat dog food if you get hungry enough, even though you would never do that in a usual situation. Even though it's not tasting good, at least it's filling the need that you have at the time. The types of abuse that most people suffer is, of course, the one we always think of, physical abuse. Someone's beating you up. You're getting physically assaulted. And then we've got neglect, where your needs are not being met. Your needs for food and shelter are not being taken care of. Then we've got emotional or psychological abuse, where someone is taking out their anger on you. They're affecting you emotionally. They're yelling. They're doing the silent treatment. They're very manipulative with gaslighting and criticizing you unnecessarily. And then you've got spiritual abuse. That's where you're restricted from maybe attending worship services or reading religious materials, or you're forced to do some of those things. Financial abuse. You're restricted from seeing anything about your finances or taking a certain job. Or sexual abuse, where you have unwanted sexual acts being done to you or being asked of you. It can be touching, it can be conversation, or it can be actually physical acts. You know, in the sex trafficking industry, there's just so much that occurs as sexual abuse because you're being utilized for payment, and that is a form of sexual abuse. Now we've got trauma. Now trauma is either big T trauma or little t trauma. Big T trauma is, like we talked about, the wars, a hurricane, something terrible happening. That's a one and done, big, huge trauma. And then you have little t trauma, where it's actually little bits of trauma that happen over and over and over again over an extended period of time. And that actually proves out to have the same effect as the big T trauma, the same amount of hurt in our brains and our bodies. It actually can do just as much damage. So little t trauma can actually be bullying, repeated neglect, or repeated emotional abuse. Those things over a long period of time add up to one big T trauma. So we need to dive in deeper to how our abuse and trauma manifest. It creates all sorts of cycles and patterns. And one thing is called the cycle of abuse. And it's basically a cycle of tension building where you feel like you're walking on eggshells, and then an explosive incident where actually an abusive event happens. And then you get into a denial and calm period where you actually blame yourself and deny that anything ever happened. And then you get into the honeymoon phase, or also what's called the love bombing phase. It's where you get all this excessive attention and romance, and all these great things occur. Now, I can tell you in my example of my life what would happen. For 6.5 years, every week, it would be a day or two of tension, and I'd walk around on eggshells and be concerned. I'd watch everything I say. I'd make sure I did everything just right, just because I could tell he was in a mood. And then the explosive incident would occur. He would get mad at me. He would tell me everything I was doing wrong, and how I wasn't loving enough, or I wasn't a good enough wife, or if I did this, if I just did that, I would be better. And then he would do the silent treatment for several days, or he would just not show up. He would be gone from the house, and I wouldn't hear from him. Then he would come back, and I would apologize for everything I did wrong, and I would take the blame and say I was sorry, and then the honeymoon phase would start. And we'd have several days of the honeymoon, and I would feel great, and it's like you're on this pedestal. Well, this is how the addiction happens, because it's very addictive when you're at this high level of the pedestal of love and you're getting all this attention. You'll do anything to get back there, and you'll do anything to stay there. And that is how it becomes an addictive cycle. So how do you recognize if you're in an abusive situation or if you're with an abusive partner? if they're really jealous, if they like to isolate you, if they are hypersensitive or very moody, they get overreactive to just little things. They are controlling. They have unrealistic expectations. Those are some indications. Why do we stay in those environments? Why do we put up with that? Well, sometimes for some people it's financial. They just don't think they can afford to live on their own. Some people do it just because they're scared of what's going to happen. Who am I going to be with in unfamiliar circumstances? You know, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Some people do it because they think it's better for their kids. There's a whole number of reasons why we do things. In your workbook, there are 18 steps of how to safely leave an abusive situation. The average abused person goes back 4 times. You know, I don't want you guys to feel bad about that. Why do we do that? Because we have hope, we have love, we have mercy, we have forgiveness. Those are things that are wonderful to have. You always want to give a second chance or a third. You always want to try again and again. And it's okay. And these tools I'm giving you can be used whether you're in the middle of it, you're out of it, or you're going back into it. It's okay. Just know that you've got to stay strong and learn what I'm giving you to do. And at some point, you'll make the right decision. So if you do leave on an occasion, you have to look at what is different, what's better. Are you more calm? Are your kids in a better place? Are they laughing, playing? Does everybody seems more comfortable, more peaceful? Try to remember the past. Actually journal and write a timeline of what's occurred. And don't go into that amnesia and romanticize, because sometimes we forget all the bad and we romanticize about all the good times and we forget the stuff that really happened. So that journal and that calendar keeping and documenting what is occurring and when it occurred helps you solidify the reason you left in the first place. There are several steps to healing from abuse and trauma. Regardless of if you're out of the situation and you've not gone back or you're in it, these will help you. Acknowledge that you're in an abusive situation. Provide yourself care. Set some boundaries. Understand your identity. Create healthy relationships. Learn to trust again and learn to forgive. So that's a long list. So I'm going to give you an example from the continuation of my story I told you in a previous video. So I got to the place of acknowledging my abuse. Now, what did I do after that? That first step. I went and took care of myself and set some boundaries. I met with my husband at the time and said, hey, if we're going to continue, here are my boundaries. This is what I'm going to have. And he said, no, I'm not doing that. Okay, of course, that was the end of our relationship, but I still took care of myself. That doesn't mean that's what's going to happen to you, but that is what happened in my circumstance. From that point on, I went and got help. I went and got counseling. I learned about myself. I learned about my feelings, my emotions, what I valued, and I created my identity. I got my identity back through counseling. And during that time, I made many friends, healthy relationships with friends, and they helped me learn how to trust again. And eventually, I was able to forgive my ex-husband. I was able to forgive everything he did. And that's a beautiful place to be. And you can do that too. Acknowledging is half the battle. The next part is a lot of hard work. I can say this, that the good news for me is I'll never go back because I did that hard work. And my hope for you is that you will be determined to see it through and do the hard work, that you will learn about yourself and be strong in your identity, and you will go from victim to victor.